Depending upon your time zone, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whatever the case might be for you. But we are super excited here, the team at Thoughtexchange and our awesome partners from the great state of Michigan. We're excited. We're excited to be here to lean into part two of a dialogue that we began a month or so ago, presenting the value of anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations to your school board. How do we do this? How do we avoid a lot of the noise and the clutter and the traffic at this busy intersection in this time that we all get to lead and serve through? As I reflect upon part one of this work, a few things come to mind. The first thing that comes to mind was just the sheer volume of participation. The volume of participation during the live event, as well as those who went back and took part in watching the recording. That told me that we were really into a very timely topic. Thus, this energy drove us to moving into part two. Why do I think part two of this work is important? A good friend of mine and author of the groundbreaking, I would say, work, Courageous Conversations About Race, Glenn Singleton. Glenn is the one, of course, through his research that introduced me to the Courageous Conversations compass. And upon that compass, you'll find 4 quadrants: thinking, believing, acting, and feeling. Singleton would also say that it's okay to be in either one of those 4 spaces, but you cannot stay there. The goal is to move around all 4 of those areas in an attempt to become centered around a very difficult conversation. And as I reflect on part one, the reason I elevate the Courageous Conversations compass is we spend a lot of time in feeling and believing. It was fresh. It was on our minds. You could feel that energy as we engaged in that conversation, and it's still going if you look at news articles today. So it's okay to be in feeling around this work. Many people through the chat and through the comments and follow up, we saw them moving from feeling into believing. Maybe the CRT group hasn't come to my district yet, but I've seen enough now. I've heard enough now to believe that I better focus in on this work. But that's only 2 areas, feeling and believing. In order for us to get centered, and Singleton would say, when we are centered in a difficult conversation, that's when we get to the best ideas and we do our best work. But we now have to keep moving around that compass. We have to get into thinking, and we have to get into acting. Engaging in these conversations with our board, once we get through the feeling and the believing, it's going to require some strategic thinking and some strategic acting. And it's for that reason that we moved into part 2, and we brought both Dr. Shivers and Dr. Davis back to extend this dialogue. So I'm excited that I get to pull this group together. I'm excited that so many of you are leaning in. And in a role, the superintendency, that's not often celebrated, I say to you that when you kick off the school year that's upon many of you right now, this work will matter. It will matter for children. It will matter for your community. As we look at polarization, it's just simply not going anywhere. The Delta variant is upon us. Due to that variant, communities are starting to make some decisions again around masking, to mandate or not to mandate. Blend in a midterm election greater polarization. Who centers and grounds this conversation in the education community? Those of you who are leaning into this work, school superintendents. And it's going to be hard to anchor yourself if you have not done the work of self-reflection in this area. So hopefully this creates a brave space and a safe space for all of you to continue to anchor your thoughts, your feelings, your beliefs, and your actions so that you can show up for your community and your children in your most powerful way going into this new school term. I was at the National School Public Relations Association conference a few weeks ago, and I had the opportunity to present with two senior PR folks from across the country. And to a person, they said this conversation is so important to how they enter into the new school year. So thank you for building muscle. Thank you for leaning in. We're going to move into a new space today, that feeling of thinking and that feeling of that space of acting. Moving into that space of thinking and acting. Brian Davis, a student of this work, has done significant work in this area. We're going to be excited to hear from him. And we're always excited to hear from Dr. Serena Shivers. She shared some resources with us the last time, as well as the brilliant commentary that she brings to this work. Kick us off, Dr. Shivers, as we lean into this conversation in terms of thinking and acting.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for having both myself and my colleague, Brian Davis. We represent Michigan Association of Superintendents and Administrators here in the great state of Michigan, and both of us are responsible for professional learning, professional growth, mentoring, and coaching superintendents across the state, as well as helping superintendents navigate the superintendency and being willing to be a vessel of information, a vessel of support. And no other time than the present have we needed to do that, as we wrestle with, as you so eloquently laid out, Dennis, two challenges that really have kind of covered over this past school year and just won't seem to go away. One of them is a long-term issue, which I'll address that in just a moment. But the first one, I will just say that I've had also many conversations. In fact, just received a text from many school districts are wrestling with what does the next school year look like with the Delta variant being present. And underneath that concern of safety and security for our students and their mental health and well-being also is what we know is the challenge around social justice and equity. And the challenge we know that existed last year and showed itself last year in terms of all of our young people, no matter their race, their ethnicity, or their background, being able to have the tools and the resources and entering into what was a very unprecedented year last year with the same sort of opportunities and robust learning as their peers. We know that didn't happen. And we know that the pandemic was a challenge to Black and Brown students the most, although it was a challenge to all students across the country. So that being as it is, and as it was, we were hoping to see in the rear view mirror and not see COVID as being so much of an issue and a challenge entering into the school year. It is. And so we have to center ourselves around what does this next school year look like in the event that our children across this country are still in some sort of hybrid, some sort of virtual, some sort of different school year, because we know that they will be. Right up butted next to that is this conversation around equity and critical race theory and how we navigate those waters as well. As I mentioned in my introduction, Brian and I are leaned on by superintendents to answer these questions, to provide for them some support, and really encourage them to delve deeply into the challenges around equity and social justice and not run from them, and provide for them the tools and the resources that they need in terms of being able to have these very challenging conversations with their peers and with their board and with their leadership team, So these are the things and the skills and the tools that Brian and I have equipped ourselves with, and in return are equipping our superintendents and their leadership teams around the state. We're getting ready to launch an 18-month Beyond Equity professional learning series for about 14 school districts across the state. And this opportunity, regardless of the size of the district, regardless of the demographics of the district, regardless of the community, we are going to be working with these districts across the state and helping them being able to courageously step into these conversations. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Brian, who will talk a little bit about what he's been working on, what he is learning, and what we hope to be able to offer for superintendents across the state of Michigan.
Thank you, Dr. Shivers, and thank you, Dr. Carpenter, and to all of you who are joining us today. Really appreciate this opportunity to share a little bit of my journey and some of that work. So I'm going to share a screen, and we will make these slides available. I know the last time I shared a few slides, individuals said, I really like that, or it spawned some thought in my own thinking and reflecting and believing. If that happens to be the case again today, certainly we'll do that. So I'm just going to recap quickly a couple of the things I talked about last time and transition more into that acting phase this afternoon. So you're a policymaker, you're a superintendent, you're a district leader, you're having conversations with your Board of Education. It's at that governance table and team where policies are made, where decisions are made that are going to impact everything you do across your school community. And we talked last time about you need to build first and foremost your own personal capacity to do this work. It's very difficult to engage and have any conversation around critical race theory if you haven't first had the conversation around what does equity and diversity and social justice mean to X school district. So make a commitment to do this work, become deeply aware of your core values as a leader, as a governance team with your school board, as you compare those with the values of your community, because we know we can be about performative work, where we make a statement when something happens across our country and we put out a few words on paper and we post it on our website, to real transformative work, to be able to say, how do we begin to address the institutionalized racism that may or may not exist in our local school community? Begin to understand your own privilege and bias, your identity, the identity of others, and how those intersect within your community so that you become more aware of the microaggressions that you may be unintentionally occurring in your district at that board table as part of that governance team. And I think it's important too, as you do this work, assess where and how you spend your time, in what communities, where do you live, where do you work, where do you play? Are you intentionally intersecting yourself with others who don't look like you, think like you, worship with you, play with you, to be able to understand the identities that others bring to the table in the conversation. So some steps to consider as you're working as a school superintendent with your governance team, with your board, is to build that commitment, to identify those core values and beliefs, to establish a core mental model within your community that can begin to develop the basis of a strategic plan. When you have a strategic plan, eventually fully developed, that embeds the lens of social justice and equity in it, when those conversations come to the public comment at your board table, you're able to reflect back on the conversations and commitments you have already made, that have already been adopted by your board, that have already been established in your board policy. You need to be able to identify resources to support that work, to learn together. And I'm going to talk in a few moments about an equity audit that we're going to be working with the 14 school districts across our state of Michigan. It's one sample of many that are out there. And to be able to build that capacity, obviously, with your leadership team, your teacher leaders, your administrators, your equity alliance, and to continue learning together. So as you have those conversations and you think about an audit, some actionable steps, where are we at in our school district? How do we take real stock in what we do? Being able to look at your organizational structure. Who has voice and who has power and at what place and when? What does achievement look like for each student across different demographics? How are our remote learners doing different than our hybrid learners, doing different than our in-person learners, and all the differences in between those different subgroups? Do we have mirrors and windows in our curriculum that reflect our students that we have today in our schools? And are we preparing them to enter in a more diverse community into the future? Who is receiving more discipline referrals? Are they very subjective versus objective and the differences between those? What participation levels do we have across different student groups? What does family engagement look like? How are our policies and procedures reflective of what needs to happen today moving forward versus what's always been in place just because? It's time for us to reevaluate all of our policies and procedures, to be able to look at our relationships with respect to school climate and culture. What are the shared and lived experiences that individuals have? Being able to look at who we celebrate and what images are portrayed across our classrooms, across our community. And it's not just embedded during Black History Month or Hispanic Heritage Month or whatever community that resides within your place. How do we do land acknowledgements as we start our meetings to honor our indigenous people? And what does that political landscape look like? So there's very specific ways in which you can look at those and assess your district capacity to do this work. One happens to be through a tool developed by Dr. Shayla Griffin that we're going to be actually utilizing here in the state of Michigan. And it's the Education Justice Assessment and Transformation Tool. And it breaks it down very deeply across, as you can see, 6 very specific areas around knowledge, biases, and beliefs, where you begin to interrogate as a school community, as school leaders, as policymakers, your own biases and beliefs in this social justice work. You then begin to look at teaching and learning, being able to address your curriculum through the lens of social justice. Is it relevant, interesting, diverse, and how does it empower our students to move into a diverse and ever-changing world? To be able to dive deeply into relationships and climate. Are they deep relationships? Are they collaborative? Are they equitable across differences? Behavior discipline, policy procedures, images, and celebrations. Within each one of these, there are many questions that are provided for districts to be able to ask and assess where are they at. Given that we're having conversation about doing this work at the board table, I wanted to focus just for a few moments on policies and procedures, because that's the work of a school board. That's the work that you do as a school superintendent, as a governance team, from which everything else flows. So do you have a mission and vision statement that includes a commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice? If you don't, that's perhaps a good first place to begin after you've done that reflective work. To be able to move from performative to transformative. There's just an example there that's provided in the EJAT tool as one way to do that. Do you have recruitment practices that attract a diverse pool of candidates committed to this work? What do your policies and procedures say about your hiring policies to reflect a commitment to building a community of social justice educators? And more importantly, beyond hiring, what are your retention practices that reflect a commitment to retain a community of social justice educators? Within your policies and procedures, there should be a clear and widely understood process through which decisions are made, and that it communicates inclusiveness of multiple perspectiveness, of multiple stakeholders, and employees across all levels are attentive to the different power dynamics that come into play. If you have a white superintendent, like when I was in my district recently, with a majority white school board with only one person of color, that lens through which multiple stakeholders had to come to the table didn't exist in the way in which I know that it could have or should have been done. And all of those decisions, once you have that protocol in place, are made with consideration through a diversity, equity, inclusion, and most importantly, a social justice lens. Does your budget have resources actually supported to doing this work? There's nothing more frustrating by establishing a mission and vision and coming up with action plans and getting to the place where it's time to take action and there aren't resources to do that. And then when the board is approving these resources to do that, and you get the noise from the community, why are we spending our public tax dollars on this work? You can point back to your strategic plan, your audit, your core mission and vision and values, and why are we doing this? And being able to look at your facilities as well. Students and educators, are their social identities taken into account when you're making everything from teacher assignments to class assignments? These are all policy things that as a superintendent and a board, this is where that work needs to rest. Are these practices based in promising research around social justice? What kind of data are you utilizing to track and disaggregate information related to your goals? And how are you sharing that in such a way and making it accessible to all of your stakeholders across the community so that we all understand what our collective responsibility and individual responsibilities are to this work? Are your forms socially just? Everything from your enrollment forms to how kids apply and get into your advanced placement classes within your school district. We need to be looking at those things. There are so many ways that you commit microaggressions just by the simple forms that we're asking people to identify and check a box related to their identity. How are your administrative team, your building leaders, your building principals, how are they serving as instructional leaders across your teaching staff and support staff to be able to gather information around feedback, especially regarding your social justice practices? Do you create a space for equity team development and power with a shared understanding of these issues? Do you have a director of social justice and equity and inclusion in your district? How has he or she championed school leaders at each of your buildings to create equity teams, to have these conversations and serve as a communication loop back? To be able to assess and develop not only their own building mission goals and objectives based upon the district work, but the ability then where the rubber hits the road to really take action and disrupt what's happening at the classroom level, and to hold a level of accountability for our marginalized students and their families. By doing this work of establishing your reflection on who you are as a superintendent, your board being able to identify their own privilege, their biases, taking all of that to developing your core values and a strategic plan, doing a deep equity audit into that work, you're able then to bring about that transformative piece in terms of acting. So you have to do a lot of heavy lifting within this. You want to bring action to that. I've talked about some of these at the last time that we met. Briefly mentioned the Equity Alliance team. How do you build in monthly reports to your board about the work that you're doing, your resource allocation? How do you build networks across your community to build those external inclusion partners, your parents, your alumni, other state associations or organizations to do that? And in closing, I'm just going to have you reflect on some key questions. You don't have to do that deep audit right now. That's a journey that takes time. But maybe you reflect on today. Who has the power and voice in your district and community? How, who, and when is most directly impacted or affected today? And as you do this work around social justice. And once you make this commitment, how and when will you know that you made a difference and progress toward whatever goals you identified? What data marks you're going to be able to look at? And what change can you expect in the short term? And what are those longer goals that you're going to establish? More importantly, as Dr. Shivers mentioned, there's all kinds of conflict and barriers and things that are being put in our place, whether it's a global pandemic, whether it's politics in a midterm election, whether it's people just not understanding. How do we respond to conflict at that board table? What is your policy during public comment? How do you start your meetings with respect to revisiting your core mission, values, and beliefs? To be able to talk about why this work is important, what everyone connected to the system should know, learn, understand, and implement. It can't just be the superintendent speaking this language. It can't just be the Board of Education. It needs to be embedded throughout the organization itself. Where will this work take you? Where will it take your board? Where will it take your students, your families? Where will it take your community? And what in the system has prevented this work from happening before? Why haven't we engaged in this conversation before? Why does it take individuals coming to the board table around critical race theory? Why did it take a global pandemic? Why are we having this conversation now? Why didn't we have it before? So being able to spend some time talking about what were those barriers that prohibited us or inhibited us from doing that work. So there are some pieces that you can perhaps take away or reflect upon to think about how might I take strategic action as a policymaker, as a superintendent with my Board of Education back in my local schools. Dr. Carpenter.
Thank you so much, Doc. That was spot on in terms of getting to acting. Some clear action steps, equity audit. Then when questions are framed, you have something to point back to systemically. Here's what we agreed to. Here's what the data has suggested to us in terms of moving forward in our district. I'm just going to submit to you that this is a topic in my mind that if you wait until an issue arises in your district, or there's some faction in the community, whether it be small itself as large, or whether you're in a community in which that faction is truly large. But if you wait for them to show up at the schoolhouse door to think about this work, you're too late. You are too late. You'll be in a reactionary mode, and they are operating, my guess, in a very, very strategic way. So you're behind. Thank you for that guidance. Thank you for those thoughts. And surely those are slides that we would love to share with all of our registrants as we move forward. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Andy Krentz, my esteemed colleague, and he's going to launch an exchange to keep the conversation going, getting our participants engaged as well.
Thanks, Dennis. Yeah, let's have a conversation, everyone. In a second here, I'm going to share my screen and invite you to have a conversation that we're going to let unfold in real time. And then our speakers, along with Dr. Carpenter, are going to be able to drill into that in real time. Every exchange has 3 steps. You're going to share your perspectives in response to an open-ended question. You're going to consider and rate the thoughts of others. And then, as I mentioned, in real time, we're going to drill into those responses. There are many pieces that have come up here that I'm sure are piquing your interest and making you want to highlight areas that you feel that would be best drilled into with more intentionality for the time we have remaining. And I would encourage you to be very courageous and vulnerable with how those thoughts are shared. So there's 2 ways to join the exchange. You can click the link that has shown up in the chat as we speak, or you can open up a camera on a personal device and point that camera at the QR code and join the exchange that way. I would just lean on you all a little bit in terms of the intentionality with which you approach the conversation. Maybe there's something from among those poignant questions that Dr. Davis just shared. Maybe there's something around critical race theory that you feel needs to be highlighted with more intentionality. Please share those thoughts in the exchange. I will start the clock, and we will resist the temptation to talk all the way through this process as you participate. Please share at least 1 thought each, everyone. And the disclaimer on that is it may not be you may not feel like your perspective represents the group. I would challenge you on that. Share the thoughts that are on your mind, and let's let the group decide what's going to be most powerful for us to focus on for the remainder of our time. Please join the exchange now and share a thought or 2. Very compelling thoughts in here. And for those of you that are watching the screen, what you're seeing here on the screen is just a visual representation of what's happening virtually as we join this conversation from across the country. And on the right-hand side, you're just seeing thoughts move around based on what's resonating with the group and how different perspectives are being elevated based on what you feel is most important or what resonates with you most. With about 1.5 minutes to go, if you haven't started starring thoughts at this time, I'd ask you to start doing that. Just click on Done Sharing, and that'll take you to the star step, and you'll be asked to rate thoughts on a 5-star scale. Again, if something resonates with you, please give it a high rating. If something is not resonating with you, feel free to give it a low rating. You're not making value judgments on people. You are making value judgments on the perspectives that we want to spend our time on for the remainder of the hour that we've got. Fantastic. I'm just going to give you 5 more seconds. Assign those stars to that last thought. And we're seeing the conversation take some shape. Dennis, I'll highlight a couple of these thoughts just in screen sharing, and you take the conversation where you want it to go. But certainly this one has trended to the top of the pile around getting the board on board for doing the work, and specifically around problematic board members or those who have polarizing opinions on the equity work in the district. What's interesting to you about how that's risen to the top of this conversation, given the context of our presenters today?
Yes, not surprising, not a school board, but I was looking at some news last night about a board of commissioners for a county. And the head of public health was there explaining the importance of masking as this Delta variant is emerging. And that public health official, 25 years in the work in multiple locations, literally across the globe, was met with a room full of resistance. Many of them holding signs that said, "We will not comply." And there were members of the governance team who, in my opinion, from watching the story unfold and listening to the line of questioning presented to this health official, who were in solidarity with the folks in the room. That same thing can happen in a school board room. That same thing happens in school board rooms. So how do you, as a leader, be proactive in that conversation and really being honest with yourself in terms of reading the tea leaves? Is this a conversation that I'm investing the right amount of time and moving forward? And if you are investing that time, the second question is, am I the person to keep moving it forward, or what other resources do I need to bring to the table? Maybe there's an external expert. Sad but true, but maybe there's a person who shows up different than you or I as the leader, who your audience or your governance team might be able to hear differently. When I was young in my career, I used to believe that I needed to do all the work and get all of the credit for it. But the further I went along in my career, I honored and I understood that the work was about outcomes for those that I'm serving. So if it takes a different face, if it takes a different individual to get my children served, then I'm committed to getting children served. I'm not committed to the credit. Is that right? Does it not evoke some feelings in you that you might wish were not there? All of that can be true. But at the end of the day, I want my children served. So really, really reflecting on what it looks like in your community. How strategic am I being? Are there other resources I need to bring to the table to move the conversation? And do it. LeBron James and Anthony Davis had a meeting a few days ago with Russell Westbrook. And the news report this morning said that LeBron said to Russell, we want you to join this team, but in order for this to work, all three of us have to put our egos to the side. We'll find out next year if that's going to work or not, but Russell Westbrook was signed to a Lakers team that's already star-studded, because the end result is what matters. So if the end result is changing outcomes for all children, and all simply meaning all, sometimes as the leader in the big chair, the LeBron James of your education community, you have to put that ego to the side. So that would be my way of tackling that question, Andy.
That's really great. I want to link these together and give Dr. Davis and Dr. Shivers the chance to participate. These top three are really linked, and I'm just going to highlight them all in succession here and give you the opportunity to speak, should you like to do so.
I even think the conversation around facilitating with parent community is linked. I mean, what I hear in those questions is, how do I get this work started with either just my stakeholders in general, or my stakeholders who may be less than likely or less than interested in this work. So I take the approach of what Dr. Carpenter said in terms of, having to meet people where they are, so to speak. I also think, in my experience, there's two ways that I look at this. One, and I don't know any way to say this than just to be blunt about it, but we make the assumption that everyone is a decent human being. And I love to make that assumption because I'm a glass half full person. But what this work has taught me is that some people really do have pain, hate, disregard for other people in them. And it makes this work very difficult, because sometimes this is the first time that you truly encounter it, is when you are talking about these really tough topics. People are able to mask what's inside of them until they really have to answer some of these tough questions. So on one side, I would say, start with the willing few, because some people just don't desire to do this work, and you can't force people to change. If they're not decent people and they don't wish to be decent people, then you have to maybe use other strategies to get the people out of the positions that they're in, or however that might look. So let's just assume that everyone on your board is a decent human being and is willing to do this work, but you're still not sure how to get started. I firmly believe that you have to shift people's premises and beliefs first by them understanding why. And for me, that strategy to tackle the why has always been to do collective book studies, reading a collective piece of literature that allows for us to have common voice, common theme, common narrative, even if we don't agree, we're talking some common language. I thought I had the book handy, that's why you guys saw me looking around, but I don't. I've mentioned it to Brian. Brian probably has it. He knows what I'm gonna mention, so he's gonna whip it out in a moment. The book is called Beyond Equity. And building equity. It's really about the building level, at the building level, what equity should look like. But the book is really, in my opinion, a roadmap for a board member or a community leader or a parent or an administrator to understand what equity should look like in the lived experiences of our students day in and day out. I did that book study with my board. You heard me mention it before. We did it as part of a study session before each regular board meeting, and I invited administrators to join. And it really helped me be able to shape the conversation with my board members and be able to hear who maybe was challenged by the content. It gave us some really rich dialogue to agree to disagree around, and to really come up with what our next steps were going to be as a district. So if you are not able to afford a person to come in and facilitate that with, some sort of robust professional development with your district, or if you're not even sure you're ready for that, I would start with doing some sort of book study with your board so that you can have some common language and some common thought, some common discussion. And at the end of that book, there is an audit. There is a student audit, I believe, a parent audit, a community audit. One of the three, or not two of the three, are at the end of that book. And it helps you be able to gather some data about where you are as a school district.
I would just add to the conversation, Andy, to bring this back to the board table itself and individual board members, is why did they run and decide to be on the Board of Education? What was their purpose? What was their motivation to do that? And assuming a positive intent piece, it wasn't because of a single item issue. Sometimes that does occur. And being able to ground ourselves in, you are here to reflect each and every student, each and every family, each and every staff member across our school community. So what was your purpose in joining on the board? And being able to have some really strong conversations around values and beliefs. So for example, we might agree on the value of public health. All of us on this exchange today believe in public health. We want all of the members of our community to be healthy, but we might differ in our beliefs around wearing a mask. And it's where we can find commonality around our values from which the conversation can begin. To be able to say, we value that every student who graduates from our school district is able to do X, Y, or Z. Now let's challenge our beliefs and our assumptions perhaps about different communities as we do some of the things that Dr. Shivers suggested by being able to engage in learning together. But at the same time, what story does our data tell us? What does our data tell us about how each of our students are doing within our respective schools, within our curriculum, our graduation rates, and so on, and be able to tackle and dispel some of those myths that occur? It's being able to have, as a superintendent, oftentimes individual one-on-one conversations with board members to be able to share what my core values and beliefs are around this topic. I know that Dr. Shivers mentioned last time we were together that you have to be able to evaluate, is this a paycheck that you're willing to give up, or is it a paycheck that you have to have in between time? Because there may be spaces and places where the conversation is not willing to move forward and you're stuck and you're not able to lead that work. The other piece, and I think we'll get to it in the exchange and talking about the work we're going to be doing in Michigan, is I'm not able to do this work alone as a white male. There are communities that I can't go into and have this conversation that Dr. Shivers can. She can have that conversation and I can be there, but I have to do so much more than just show up as an equity social justice champion. I'm a white male who comes with a lot of privilege, a lot of bias, and a lot of thoughts from different members of the community. But together, perhaps we can have those conversations. Much the same way, she's not able to say even the exact same words I do at a table that looks all like me and be heard in the same way. So how do you partner together with those resources within your community to make those bridges with the communities and where you want to be able to lift that voice and to be able to have these conversations together? I think those are all potential strategies. How do you network with another district who's already doing this work?
Yeah, before we move on to the next thought, there is some safety in numbers. That's why groups are packing the school board room and rallying behind the 5 or 6 people who've strategically been placed there for public comment. And as a lifelong educator, I totally come in peace when I say we have not done a great job as educators in creating that same safety for all of us in numbers. So when I see the state of Michigan pulling this work together out of Serena's office and Brian's office to have some common learning across multiple superintendents and multiple districts, that provides a level of air cover that I believe some regions and some school district communities that touch each other are just not leveraging. So thank you for doing that. And that's a model that many states and regions need to follow, in my opinion.
As I transition to the next thought, what I hear in what all three of you have just shared is just the word that's in my mind is scaffolding. Scaffolding for the type of conversation we're having, and whether that's shared narratives and shared vocabulary, whether that's a refocus on why public figures have taken the office that they've done. We talk a lot about the these thinking, acting, believing, and feeling cognitive behaviors and all of that, and the scaffolding that provides to be able to have these courageous conversations. And that's the jumping off point that I feel like I just want to name is, how are you creating that scaffolding? What specifically are you doing, even around self-reflection, like what we see in this thought? There's a lot of barriers that folks can hide behind around even just the busyness of our calendars. An opportunity to speak into that.
Yeah, so I'm going to actually tie that to the question that is related to the sessions that Brian and I are doing in the state of Michigan, because I think what we hope comes out of this work is to impact the 1.5 million kids across the state. But we know we can't do that unless administrators self-reflect, leaders self-reflect, our superintendents self-reflect, because as we say, when we're talking to any group of people, this work starts with you. It starts intimately with you as an individual, your own walk through your past, your own walk through your experiences, your values, your beliefs, and really understanding how they came to be. Like, people don't necessarily stop and think like, why do I not like a certain group of people? Or why do I not like certain food? Or why do I not want to live in a certain community? And you have to kind of start unpacking these things and realize, maybe there were some things in your home. Maybe there were some things in your place of worship. Maybe there were some things in the communities that you chose to live in, or your parents chose to live in or not live in, that all started to shape who you are as an individual and what you believe, but more importantly, how you show up. Because who you are and what you believe is how you show up to people in your day-to-day interactions with them. So we start with the superintendents and their leadership teams really doing this work on their own. So to kind of share what the 18 months look like, the first 6 months is that self-work that we've been talking about. That's really digging into who I am, what I believe, how things have come to be across this country as it relates to the lived experiences of African American, of Indigenous people, of women, of those that may be in the LGBTQ community, whatever the areas of diversity and injustice we are talking about. That first chunk is really you dealing with that with yourself. And I can tell you, having done this work now for a very long time, the people that are facilitating this work for us are called the Justice League Collaborative. Brian talked about the tool that Dr. Griffin created. I helped initially create that work and that tool over a decade ago. It's gone through many reiterations, but I can tell you from when Dr. Griffin and I started this work over 10 years ago, it started because there was an exhibit called Race, Are We So Different? Through the Smithsonian that was a traveling exhibit. And that exhibit was coming to the University of Michigan's campus, and they asked us to send school districts and teachers from all around the county. And we said, there's no way that we're just sending people to this very, very, very dark period of time in American history exhibit without them having the tools and resources to be able to have these meaningful conversations. So that's how this work got started. That's how it was created, being able to equip educators to lead their parents and their community and their students through these very robust conversations. So that work, the Justice League Collaborative, has turned into a very, very, very in-depth training module, and they will be doing it with 14 school districts for the first part. The second part is called the Deep Dive into the EJAT. That's the tool that Brian was talking about. So they will spend the next 6 months or so, roughly that amount of time, doing a deep dive into the EJAT, looking at each one of those 6 components and doing an audit in their district so they can understand how their district shows up in terms of policies, how it shows up in terms of teaching and learning, how it shows up in terms of discipline and culture, how it shows up in terms of relationships between staff and students and staff and staff, and they will walk away with a lot of data about their district. The last 6 months, they get to spend with Brian and I, and we are going to take those 2 experiences and help them develop a plan for their specific district around diversity, equity, social justice and inclusion. And we will spend 6 months with them so they can create the plan and launch the plan. And Brian and I will be coaches and mentors to those 14 school districts during the first 6 months of the implementation of the diversity, equity, and inclusion plan. So that is what the 18 months look like. And we start our first cohort next week.
I want to, I'm conscious of the time, and at the risk of taking us on a giant left with not enough time to go, I'm just conscious that the bottom of this exchange has thoughts specific around critical race theory and the leveraging of the opportunity to have these conversations to affect change. It didn't rise to the top of this exchange, which is fine, but just naming it in terms of that space that conversation holds in the public psyche right now. And that'll be the last thought I present to you. Dennis, you can take this where you want to go, and then the final words in the seminar today will be yours. But I just wanted to put that on the table. It's not something that resonated with everyone, but there is an opportunity here. There's also the challenges that exist are many. But what would you say to that?
Yeah, there's so much learning that can happen through clarification. And what's intended for whatever purpose, whether you just want to minimize it to good or bad, something that's intended for bad or something that's intended to stop momentum, however you might want to describe it, it can turn around and it can work in your favor. So if that conversation is going on in your school district community that is critical race theory, and it's being used as a synonym for social justice or a synonym for equity work or a synonym for inclusion or a synonym for all children in being responsible for their learning, what an opportunity to clarify. So someone said in the exchange, which data point would you start with? We know what we're responsible for as educators. We're responsible to enhancing the learning and lives of young people. So let's just begin with our learning data. Let's just start there. Because unless your school district community is a statistical outlier, I'll just name, pretty brutally honest, I think, the darker the skin, the lower the performance. The darker the skin, the greater engagement in special education, the greater engagement as it relates to disciplinary infractions. So we can begin with that data as we take these misconceptions around CRT and really get our community to a different place, but beginning with that board. And that's why this session is so critical, because you'll begin with the board and really get them moving. And what better way? Prior to this conversation, there's not a school board member out there that wouldn't tell you that they made data-focused or data-driven decisions. This space is no different. This space is no different. If you look intently at the data, it'll tell you the story that this work is important. And if that's not the case in your district, I'd love for you to tell me what you're doing so that Thoughtexchange can help spread it across the continent. All right, any other thoughts there, Serena and Brian? Thank you all so much, number one, for leaning in and engaging in part two. And I really believe that we are on to something that's adding immense value to those who are willing to lean in. Any final thoughts from the two of you?
Brian?
There's no time better than the present to do this work.
No time better than the present.
And to give yourself the permission, as I have done, to know that I'm going to make mistakes. And as I do this work each and every day, I learn that there's more that I did not know and did not understand. But each day that I take in understanding that which I did not know, I'm able to apply that to my future work. It takes patience and time to build the capacity to do this, to build the confidence and the competency, but you have to start. And once you've built that confidence and competency, do that with others to bring about the kind of transformative change that we seek to build in our states, in our school districts, in our country.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so my comment is in the chat. I said, run to the smoke. We typically tell people when there's a fire to run away from it, but I say run to this because we may not have this kind of fire again. So run to the smoke, carry with you a whole lot of water and a whole lot of people in your arsenal. But I really think this is an opportunity for us to coalesce around a conversation that many districts wouldn't have otherwise. And in some of our earlier comments, we said, make sure that you have the right people, a part of this conversation. Well, educate yourself around critical race theory. Well, educate yourself around who's doing that work in your community and in your district or in your state that you can lean on as you're leaning in, because it is very, very, very challenging. And then I would also say that some of this is also a moment in time. So we need to capitalize on it, but we also need to understand a lot of the pressure that we're feeling is largely political in nature. And as we move through the next cycle of elections, it'll be something else. But this is about kids. This is about people. This is about the community. And this is about the well-being of you and I. Our social and emotional learning is at the core, the root of social justice and equity. And so let's take this opportunity to fix what's been broken for a very, very long time and not let the fire be put out where we could have ran to the smoke.
Wow, run to the smoke. I love it. Before we wrap, I'm reflecting on John Updike. He was an author born in 1932. I think he passed away 2009 or 2010. But he authored over 30 some odd novels, and he was also a literary critic. And there was one interview, I just loved his writing and loved the way he could put you in your place without you really knowing you got put in your place. But one day, a reporter asked him, they said, John, what's a leader? What's a leader? And he said, a leader is one who out of madness or goodness decides to take upon themselves the woes of a people. But he didn't stop there. He told us first, out of madness or goodness, this person decides to take upon themselves the woes of a people. But he went on to say, but there are few so foolish. Hence the erratic quality of leadership in our world. As I reflect upon my 7+ years as a superintendent and some of the conversations I leaned into and some of the things I did for children and not my own. A lot of the work I did, Landon and Layla, as I celebrate my son's 10th birthday today, they didn't need the work that I did. But I was willing to plant trees under whose shade I would never sit. And in the words of John Updike, as I reflect on it now, I'm glad I was so foolish. I'm glad I was one of the few that was so foolish. Be one of the few. Have a great, great afternoon.